What's going on, everyone? My name is Chad Meadows. You likely know me from camp at the 2025 Summer Public Forum Boot Camp. I gave the topic lecture during this summer over the camp topic, which was about French nuclear sharing. And if you haven't been under a rock, then you know that that topic wasn't chosen and that we actually are debating about the United Kingdom and whether or not they should re-enter the European Union following Brexit in 2019, 2020. So at PFPC, we wanted to provide you with the topic lecture that you would have gotten about Brexit, how you debated this topic before. And so we're going to break this up into two different parts, hopefully make it a little bit more digestible and easy for everyone to listen to. So the first part is going to be background information. We're going to cover the history of Brexit, the fallout of Brexit, and some of the major themes involved with this topic, so that you can kind of get your wheels turning for arguments. In the second part, we're going to go over the actual arguments on the topic and talk about implementation and argumentation for debate. So let's get started by talking about the history of Brexit. So a big thing to keep in mind is that the United Kingdom's history with the European Union has always been somewhat fraught. Um, Following World War II, European countries believed that essentially we could create peace on the continent that had been ravaged by two major world wars through trade. And they created what's known as an European Economic Unity, or EEC, in the 1950s. And the idea being that countries like France, West Germany, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, etc., those countries believed that an integrated European community could create peace. So, in the aftermath of the World Wars, there's been sort of like a political idea about integrating countries together so they don't go to war with each other anymore. And that's always had a fraught or tenuous history with former empires that are still very powerful. So countries like the United Kingdom and the United States want to maintain their sovereignty. So the United Kingdom attempted to join the EEC around 6 years after it was founded in the 1960s. Their application was vetoed, and eventually they kept trying. And in the 1970s, the UK did enter the EEC. There was actually a referendum almost immediately called in the United Kingdom about staying in the EEC, and it only passed by a vote of around 67%, which is pretty significant, but there's always been a relatively tenuous relationship between the UK and establishing supranational or integrated governance with with the European Union. And if I didn't mention it before, the EEC basically is just like an economic trade zone. It's liberalizing trade between all the countries that are in the EEC. It's about establishing standards for production and environmental standards and labor standards, and basically getting everyone aligned together in Europe, and then having those countries lower trade barriers with each other to create sort of preferential trade agreements between countries in Europe. And so the United Kingdom joined the EEC, that economic trade zone, in the 1970s. But there was definitely a lot of political strife over that. Um, the Labour Party, kind of like the Democrats of the UK, actually split into two parties because they were pretty split on the notion of joining the EEC. The center left Labour Party split with what's known as the Social Democratic Party because they favored European integration. And then the conservatives in the UK, I guess like the Republicans of the UK, have always been pretty against integration with Europe. Margaret Thatcher, one of the most famous prime ministers of the UK, um, negotiated a reduction in UK subsidies to the EEC budget in 1984. And she kind of was the beginning of sort of formal unraveling of the UK's relationship with the EEC, even though the EU hasn't even officially started yet. Margaret Thatcher is sort of already saying that the UK providing funds to this economic zone is hurting the sovereignty and economy of the United Kingdom, and so she doesn't like it. And so the Conservatives have kind of always been against integration with Europe. So around that time, also the 80s, 90s, the European Union deepens even further its notion of integration by creating essentially the modern European Union, which sort of incorporated the EEC into the European community. So basically, the EU is a common foreign policy, citizenship rights, and for most countries, currency, though the United Kingdom famously never joined the EU's currency system and kept their pound, which is their currency. Um, there, even when the EU is created, there's still significant frictions between the European Union countries and the UK. Two examples that always come up in the literature, if you read about it, are in the late 90s, the EU banned UK beef because of fears of mad cow disease. There were diseases in the UK's cows, and basically all the European countries sort of banded together to ban the import of those cows. That's a big industry for the UK, and it made their farmers really upset. Also, there were like, I can't believe I misspelled years, but there were like decades of disputes over like what constituted chocolate or what constitutes chocolate. Like countries like Spain, France, Belgium, Italy basically say chocolate can only be made with vegetable oil, or sorry, chocolate can only be made with cocoa oil. And the UK makes theirs with vegetable oil, and some of their products have too much milk to be considered chocolate. All to say is that the whole point of the EU and the EEC is that they're supposed to be really common standards for the production of goods and trade, supposedly for the mutual benefit of all the countries. But the United Kingdom has always sort of marched to the beat of its own drum a little bit more than the rest of the European countries. And so there's always been sort of, a like tenuous partnership between the UK and the EU. Contrast that to countries like Belgium or Italy or Spain or France, who kind of are really bought into the notion of the European Union and sort of like binding themselves together with each other and creating common standards. And so, uh, you know, the EU and the UK have this, super fraught history. But as this fraught history is sort of like barreling on, it's not as if the EU is kind of just satisfied with its current state. The other countries in the EU who are much more invested in European Union integration and making the European Union alliance even stronger, those countries are trying to make the EU stronger. And so that leads to the Treaty of Lisbon. So the Treaty of Lisbon is basically a treaty that establishes even more government-like infrastructure into the European Union. So you can kind of think about the European Union pre-Treaty of Lisbon to be kind of like a trade agreement and an agreement with each other to sort of like normalize citizenship rights and migration and labor standards and citizenship and some laws. The Treaty of Lisbon kind of starts to create the makings of like a European Union government, which is kind of, I think, how we understand it to be today. It's not just an agreement between countries. Maybe like an example might be like North America has an agreement. We had NAFTA. which is like a trade agreement and some sort of like standardization of standards and trade. Europe is going a little bit further and they're creating things like a president. So there's the president of the EU, there's a foreign minister, they can make treaties, they want to establish a common system of criminal justice. They have the makings of like a police force, right? So these are kind of things that are much more akin to the creation of what's known as a superstate. And the Treaty of Lisbon was written in 2007 and ratified by the UK and the rest of the European Union countries in 2008. But it's not well received. Not in America and not by a lot of UK commentators. So the Christian Science Monitor said it's the end of Britain as we know it. Um, and the prime minister of the time, Gordon Brown, um, kind of had promised to hold a referendum on the Treaty of Lisbon, um, basically give the people of the UK a direct vote on whether or not they actually joined the Treaty of Lisbon, not just something that the like political leaders would negotiate themselves. And kind of went back on his word on that and negotiated um, the treaty without any referendum. So a lot of people were really upset by that. They felt that essentially that the UK had almost quasi given up its sovereign status as a country, and sort of like made itself a part of this super state with the EU without any direct vote from the from the people of Britain. And it was so politically toxic. For instance, Gordon Brown, who was a part of the treaty, didn't even show up to the signing of the treaty because the fallout was pretty bad in the UK. And it was also heavily opposed by the United States. For the younger folks who kind of mostly know like politics, like in the like mid to late 2000s, I think you maybe don't quite have a context for how close the relationship between the UK and the US was at the time. It was kind of known as this like special relationship. And so the UK was always sort of like trying to balance between the relationship that it has with its European Union neighbors and the relationship it has with its former colony, the United States, which is a huge superpower, lots of money, lots of trade. And so there was also like a big kind of outcry from the United States, which believed that an independent Europe would be both bad for the relationship between the US and the UK, that they would no longer be able to sort of establish this special relationship with the UK and the United States, but that also it would like compromise some NATO commitments, and that if the European Union would create an independent sort of security force, then that hurts the US's ability to sort of, for instance, um, get the other countries in Europe to give more money to NATO. And so on both sides, Gordon Brown's kind of feeling it. And so the Treaty of Lisbon happens, and I think that kind of ratchets up the pressure for there to be a reevaluation of the UK's place in the European Union. Around 2011, David Cameron, who's the Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, um, he was the first prime minister of the UK to veto a treaty that the European Union had negotiated separately. So basically, the European Union was like, okay, all 27 countries, we're going to agree to do this treaty. And David Cameron was like, not the UK. So that's a kind of a big step because that means that whenever the European Union and their president and their diplomacy wing are talking about what the European Union will do, the fact that the UK can say, no, we don't want to do that, kind of reduces the leverage the EU has to negotiate treaties because they obviously don't speak for all members of the European Union if one of their countries can veto one of their treaties. Um, and so he's doing that because he's responding to the idea, he's responding to some of the lack of popularity that is going on with the European Union at the time. And there's also a third party in the EU that's emerging at this time, the UK Independence Party or UKIP. And basically, this party hates Europe. Well, they don't hate Europe, but like they hate the idea that the United Kingdom would give up any of its sovereignty and cede any perception that it is sort of an independent nation in favor of the EU. So they're an EU skeptic, which is a term we're going to talk about later. And obviously in Britain, in Great Britain, they have a parliamentary system. They have many third parties. And so there's a lot more room for a strong third party to challenge or to push a major party to the left or the right politically. UKIP likely would still be, aligning with the Conservative Party, but they can exact some leverage if they get enough votes. So basically, in around 2013, David Cameron gives a speech where basically says, okay, we've got elections coming up. I don't remember the exact date of the elections, but we've got elections coming up. And if the conservatives win this election and like grow the number of conservatives that are in parliament, then he would renegotiate Britain's EU membership, and he would also um, do a referendum on Brexit. Remember back when we talked about the Treaty of Lisbon, a lot of people feel as if the people of the EU, or sorry, the people of the UK were never given a direct, real vote on whether or not they wanted to join the EU, especially as sort of like this big supranational state. And so one of the things that David Cameron does is basically say, okay, I want to give everyone a vote on being in the EU. It's also important to know that at this time, the EU is perceived to not be doing well. There's a Eurozone crisis. Basically, that means that the euro, the currency of the EU, is doing really poorly. There's a migrant crisis. There's a lot of migrants pouring into countries that are causing a lot of problems with social safety nets. And when you're a part of the EU, you have to have the same, migrant policy and social welfare policy as the other countries. And so those tend to lean significantly more generous and expansive than we would expect in the United States. And so the people of the UK are sort of like feeling a little bit trapped. They basically, some people feel as if, they are forced to accept a lot of migrants. They are attached to an economy that's struggling, and it overall is hurting the standing and economy and life of the people in the UK. And so it honestly sounds familiar-ish to the United States, in a world after liberalization of trade and tons of migration into the United States. There's this big nationalist push in the United States, and so we would associate that nationalist push with the election of Donald Trump. Um, Similar-ish things are happening in the UK with Brexit. But the important thing to know is that Cameron basically says, if you vote for us, we're going to renegotiate some parts of our EU membership, and then we're also going to call for a referendum. The other important thing to know is that it's not as if Cameron is like against EU membership. He's a part of like the more moderate conservative position, which basically is that yes, we need to change how we are a part of the EU, but the UK should remain a part of the EU. So there was a referendum. I believe it took place in 2013, and turned out pretty decent, 71.8%. To be honest, I would expect a little bit more if you're voting literally on like who, if you stay in the country. And it was a huge, unexpected vote with the slim majority opting to leave the EU. Famously, pretty much all of Northern Ireland and Scotland, not all, but like huge margins, like 70-30. And those two provinces voted to stay in the EU, which like renews calls for a referendum on independence. Like if basically we want to be a part of Europe and you want to leave Europe, you should let us become an independent country so that we can join Europe again. But basically, the results were sort of like so. I don't want to say like shocking, but it was pretty shocking, right? Um, Cameron resigns. Remember, he wasn't even in favor of leaving the EU, so he's definitely not the figure that's going to sort of like preside over leaving the EU. Also, during the lead up to the referendum, Boris Johnson, a conservative in the UK, emerges as this like huge player politically, and he is able to sort of like convincingly sway a lot of people to vote to leave. And he's kind of like credited as one of the biggest figures in the Conservative Party, leading the to leave movement. If you were to examine the to leave demographics, it kind of honestly looks pretty similar to like how you might examine like 2020 election results. People who wanted to leave, people voting in favor of Brexit, were from areas with lower income and employment, and in sectors sensitive to trade and labor migration pressures. So like manufacturing, the building stuff, basically. Um, so uh, Older Brits were more likely to vote to leave, younger Brits were more likely to vote to stay. And the major factors that people sort of cited as the reason they wanted to leave were the immigration slash border policies. They wanted to create sort of like more stringent border policies. They wanted a quote fairer welfare system, whatever that means. I think that just basically means austerity, like less welfare. And they wanted to reestablish national sovereignty for the UK. It's kind of like a little bit of a nationalist moment for the UK. And Boris Johnson, I mean, I wouldn't say he's like just like Trump. They definitely are like significantly far apart politically. But like I think he's got kind of like a Trump vibe in the sense that he kind of emerges not out of nowhere, but a little bit out of nowhere, and it is so this huge player and is in favor of nationalism. So implementing Brexit was like an absolute mess. Um, Basically the UK and the EU have to basically create a withdrawal agreement, which sort of like establishes the protocols and rules for leaving the EU, and it's really hard to kind of get anyone to agree to anything. The date was pushed back multiple times. And there's also like kind of a sense of immediate regret in the EU, or sorry, in the UK about the Brexit vote. There were calls for a second referendum. And another kind of like interesting thing that happened is, so this is kind of nuts to me, but like there's a thing called like a snap election where the like group in charge can like call for elections to kind of like test their position. So the conservatives basically after the UK votes to leave the EU, but multiple times is not able to convince Parliament to sign an agreement on leaving the EU, they kind of call these snap elections to strengthen their position. So basically, they're like, "Hey, we're going to have elections in June, and these elections kind of are all about um, getting an agreement passed in order to leave the EU officially. And so we want you to vote conservative because we have a bunch of conservatives that are in the parliament, then it's a lot easier for us to negotiate a position. Well, in June, they actually like lose a bunch of seats. And so their hand is like significantly weakened and they keep failing to get parliament to sign a withdrawal agreement. Theresa May, who is the prime minister that came in after the referendum, she steps down because she can't get a deal passed. Boris Johnson is made the PM, and eventually he gets it passed, and it came into effect in January of 2020. So that is your 23-minute fast rundown of the history of the UK with the EU and the lead up to Brexit. Obviously, we're going to go really broad strokes because it's not, you could have a class on this, but that's kind of like the basics. So let's talk about the fallout of Brexit and the ways that it has affected. And my fallout analysis is going to be kind of slanted towards Brexit didn't work. And the reason that I'm slanting in that direction is because our topic kind of assumes it doesn't work, right? So when we're talking about whether or not the UK should re-enter the EU, so obviously, especially from the AF perspective, we're going to assume that, like things aren't peachy keen and that there was at least some controversy surrounding Brexit and whether or not it was effective at achieving the goals that the people who wanted Brexit promised. So why do people want to, go back into the EU? Why is there some regret of Brexit? Well, so the first is that public opinion. A source called Social Europe says every UK poll now shows a majority longs to rejoin the EU. So, according to pollsters and according to a lot of people, the public sentiment is pretty strongly in favor of rejoining the EU. A big reason for that is the economy, and I think economy is going to be a huge part of this topic. Essentially, we talked about how the roots of the EU were essentially a trade agreement. It's an economic zone, right? Well, now that the UK is no longer in the EU, what happened was now they have to independently negotiate trade deals either with the countries of the EU or the EU itself, which they have done. But those deals are still less preferential than the trade that would have otherwise happened between European Union countries if the UK was still in. And so the decline in U.S. export goods are between 30% and 6%. 30% is crazy. Like a decline of exports because of the Brexit would have a significant impact on the UK economy. Even 6% would suck. But either way, it's a decline. There's some analysis that small firms have been the most impacted. So I think economy is going to be a huge factor. There's also, when you're talking about the economy, there's going to be a hegemony component as well. Whether or not if the UK is no longer as integrated and as strong and as powerful, then they're not capable of leading as much anymore. The next big thing, but trade and the economy was one of the big reasons why people wanted to leave, and it's probably not working out. The other thing is immigration. So that was a huge part of the reason why the UK Brexited. And it's kind of like not worked that much. So essentially, what happened is what's known as the Brexit paradox. Essentially, without the EU, the UK had to make its own immigration policy. Before, there's like a very like essentially like free migration between European Union countries and somewhat restrictive immigration to countries outside of the EU zone. So it's kind of like if you're in the EU, if you're from Germany, you can move to the UK, right? And if you're from the UK, you can move to Germany. Um, and there's not a lot of since they're up all in this like thing, the EU, there's not a lot of like laws or restrictions on that. So after they leave the EU, they kind of have to create their own immigration policy. And essentially, they find themselves liberalizing or reducing the barriers to immigration that would come from non-EU member states while restricting the immigration from EU states. And so, kind of what really happened was they don't have less immigration that they had before. There's probably like around the same, if not a little more immigration. The difference is that there's a decrease in immigration from the EU because if you're in the EU, you can immigrate to any other EU country and don't have to worry about things that are complicated, like a visa or how long you stay, etc. So the EU countries, by and large, not as many people are moving to the EU, and not as many Brits are moving to the EU. But there's a lot more immigration happening from non-EU countries to the UK. And in particular, there's a lot more irregular immigration. So, immigration that's taking place where someone's claiming asylum or they're entering the country for longer than the specified time on their visa, or maybe even entering the country with sort of no status at all. And so, immigration, according to a lot of people, is like even more of a mess than it in the UK than it was before. There's some like fun graphs that just show this wild explosion of non-EU based immigration that happened on a world post Brexit. So if the people that were, wanting Brexit thought that there's not going to have immigration anymore, not the case. Definitely didn't happen. Okay, so then the next thing we can talk about is the legal infrastructure. So following Brexit, the UK basically was like, we have to create a bunch of laws that we, didn't have from before, because a lot of our legal infrastructure has been sort of like integrated from the European Union. And so the idea was like, well, we're going to create sovereignty. We're going to, be independent now because we, are our own country. Well, basically, that never happened. The BBC says that the UK retained 6,901 individual laws that were just directly borrowed from the EU. And they did like this big like review of those laws, and they basically just like agreed with like the vast majority of them and like kept them. So this like whole like thing where they were going to be this like completely sovereign country that's like so different from the EU like didn't really ever happen. And they essentially found that the legal infrastructure of the EU kind of maintained itself even after they left the EU. Um, the other thing is that they now are negotiating separate trade deals with the United States. That's a good thing or a bad thing, and I think you go out of direction. A lot of people are saying that the UK's trade deals, especially recently, are a lot better than the EU's trade deals. And that's one reason why Brexit was a good thing, because they were able to negotiate sort of like lower overall tariff rates with the US than the EU was. I think the difference is like the UK's deal is a 10% tariff rate, and the EU's deal is a 15% tariff rate, with some like guarantee of subsidies coming from the EU, though like how much they actually are going to subsidize American industries is like kind of disputed. But that's like a big part of the impact of Brexit is that the UK is able to, or maybe has to, depending on your perspective, either they're able to or they have to negotiate their own independent deals with countries. And that could lead to more favorable outcomes, or potentially if the UK and the EU were integrated, maybe they could have gotten even better terms from the US. So that leads me to the end, which is the major themes that we're seeing when we're analyzing this topic from a historical perspective as well as from um, a current perspective. The first one I think is pretty obvious. It's the populism/nationalism versus globalism debate. And more specifically, it's the Euroscepticism and Europhilia debate. Weird name. Okay, so basically, there is a group of people in the UK that are skeptical of the idea of the EU and Europe. So, in the post World War II era, as I've mentioned, the idea of Europe has been, hey, we had two bloody world wars that have dramatically shaped international relations in our countries forever. Um, we also have a pretty rowdy adversary to the east, Russia, and there's also a couple of rising states with significantly more population than any individual country in the European country in the EU, namely China and India. And so there's this idea basically that uh, Europe can kind of be more powerful and stronger if they are together. And people in the UK who believe in that are known as like Europhiles. They basically are like really into that idea, and they kind of believe that the UK should be a part of that Europe integration. There's this notion that the idea of the nation state, or an individual country having sovereignty and exercising its own position geopolitically, is kind of outdated, and that these like zones of countries banding together and working towards a common goal is actually better. I think you see that play out in a lot of different areas. There's and there's big trade zones. Um, Probably nowhere has done it to the extent of Europe. And so, yeah. But I think there's also a pushback against that, just like in the United States, when there was like kind of like a huge push for globalism in the 90s after the Cold War. Uh, that causes some frictions. It sounds nice to say that you should have trade across all countries and that you should have free immigration, but it does cause frictions with certain populations. There are industries in uh, Western countries that will be impacted by exposure to trade and immigration pressure from other countries. Namely, like in the US, we have like the industrial base, and similar in the UK, they have a pretty big reliance on industry as well. And so there's a lot of Eurosceptics who take on a more populist nationalist perspective. So I think you have those themes of populism and nationalism versus globalism. Obviously, the globalists would be in favor of rejoining the EU, and the sort of populist nationalist perspective says we shouldn't. I think there's also a notion about Europe and maybe the UK itself's role in the post-Washington consensus. So the Washington Consensus basically was this period in the glow of the post-Cold War. The Soviet Union has been defeated. The United States is kind of riding high after, winning World War II and then defeating communism. And we have the best economy in the world, and we're like amazing. It's the Washington Consensus. Every country wants to be like the U.S. So there's this explosion of countries that want to be democratic. There's an explosion of lowering of trade barriers. There's the creation of a ton of international institutions that sort of like establish um, like-minded countries into agreements that mirror the way the U.S. thinks about things. So, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about the IMF, we're talking about the WTO, and even countries that don't even agree totally with the United States still find themselves becoming attached to those institutions. So, for instance, even though at the time China is largely like a state-run enterprise economy, they still join the WTO because it's the Washington Consensus. Everyone has to think like Washington. So that's like dead. I mean, it depends who you ask. Maybe it's not dead, but like for the most part, I would say the consensus is the post-Washington Consensus no longer exists because of adversaries like China and Russia who just like are significantly more powerful, particularly China, because the U.S. itself seems to not be as interested in sort of like pursuing creating as many like-minded countries as around the world. So anyway, there's like this idea of the post-Washington consensus, and where does Europe fit into that idea? There's a lot of people who say that countries like the UK, where they're leading, could sort of like fill in for the US and kind of like establish hegemony in the absence of US hegemony. So I think hegemony is going to be a big part of this topic as well, because people are going to talk about maybe in both directions how affirming or negating could sort of like improve the UK's standing and allow them to, in a post-US dominated world, still maintain some of the benefits of the Washington Consensus. I think there's also going to be a lot of debate about the Brussels effect. So the Brussels effect basically is this idea that the EU has such a huge market and is established as a leader on standards for industries that whatever they kind of establish as the standards for an industry kind of become universalized and globalized. And so companies kind of have to look to the look to the EU and look to Europe for how what standards will dictate their products. The UK joining the EU could help to reestablish the Brussels effect. It could, or maybe the Brussels effect is bad. I don't know. But I think, the extent to which EU controls industry standards, I think will be a big thing. And the last thing I think is going to be about Trump's industrial trade policy. So Trump is really big on uh, using tariffs as like a stick to force countries to do individual negotiations with Trump on trade. So he has a trade agreement with Europe, one with the UK, etc. So how would the UK rejoining the EU affect Trump's industrial trade policies? with those countries, I think could be a big thing. And the last theme, kind of going with the Eurosceptic and Europhilia, is that those themes of Euroscepticism and Europhilia or Europhiles, I think they have a big effect on the politics of the UK. And so I think politics is going to be a big component of this topic. So that's the background in history and major themes. Check back. We're going to do another video where we're going to look through the packet and go through how to use the packet, um, what kind of arguments you might want to be making on this topic, and maybe some sort of like some analysis of the resolution and how it breaks down. Thanks for listening. Have an amazing day. Let's crush it in September.